Mafia boss survives at 81 degrees 6. Isolated in the ice, he faces the deadliest cold on Earth. The wind hit like a blade, not a gust, not a chill, a blade. It sliced through the fuselage of the downed aircraft with a sound that was almost human, almost a scream, and Dominic Varro opened his eyes to white, pure, endless, merciless white. His breath crystallized the moment it left his lips, forming tiny ice particles that drifted upward before vanishing into the frozen void. He tried to move. Pain. Answered sharp, immediate, radiating from his left side where something had impacted during the crash. The memory came in fragments, the private jet banking hard over northern Alaska, the pilot's voice cutting through static, the sudden drop that felt like falling into nothing. Then darkness, then this frozen hell. Dominic forced himself to sit up, every muscle protesting against the cold that had already begun seeping into his bones. The interior of the aircraft was destroyed, seats torn. From their moorings, the cockpit a twisted mass of metal and shattered glass. He didn't need to check on the pilot. The angle of the man's neck told him everything. He was alone. The realization settled over him, heavier than the cold. Dominic Varro, who had built an empire from nothing, who commanded the respect and fear of every major family on the East Coast, who had survived betrayals and wars and attempts on his life more numerous than he could count. He was alone in a place where none of that mattered. Here his name meant nothing. His money meant nothing. His power meant nothing. Here the only currency was survival. He pulled himself toward the emergency kit he knew every aircraft carried, his fingers already numb despite the gloves he wore. The temperature gauge on his watch, a custom piece worth more than most homes, read negative 47 degrees Fahrenheit, and it was dropping. "Think," he muttered to himself, the word coming out as a rasp. "Think, Dominic." He had been changed route to Fairbanks for a meeting that couldn't happen over phones or video calls. Some negotiations required presence, required the weight of a man standing before you while terms were discussed. The Kowalski family had been expanding their operations into territory that Dominic's organization had held for 3 generations. A conversation was needed, a firm one. Now, somewhere over the Brooks Range, the conversation that mattered most was the one he was having with himself. Stay alive. Move. Don't stop moving. The emergency kit yielded treasures: thermal blankets, flares, a first aid pack, emergency rations, a satellite phone with a cracked screen that showed no signal. He gathered everything into a pack, his movements growing slower as the cold tightened its grip. The aircraft's hull had been breached in multiple places, and what little warmth remained was bleeding out into the Arctic void. He needed shelter, real shelter. Dominic wrapped himself in the thermal blankets and forced himself to stand, using the mangled frame of a seat for support. Through the shattered window, he could see nothing but white. White ground, white sky, white horizon that seemed to curve around him like the inside of a frozen sphere. The wind had died momentarily, and in the silence he could hear his own heartbeat, too fast, too loud, fighting against the cold that wanted to slow it to nothing. He had been cold before. Growing up in Brooklyn, in the apartment with no heat because his father had drunk away the money meant for bills. He had learned what it meant to shiver through the night. But that cold had been survivable. That cold had been temporary. This cold was a predator, patient and absolute, waiting for the moment his body gave up. He wouldn't give it the satisfaction. Dominic moved toward the breach in the fuselage, each step a battle against joints that wanted to lock and muscles that wanted to freeze. Outside, the landscape was a study in desolation, rolling white that stretched in every direction without landmark or reference point. He could walk for miles and end up exactly where he started, the snow swallowing his tracks as quickly as he made them. But staying in the aircraft meant death. The temperature inside would match the temperature outside within hours, and then there would be no difference between shelter and exposure. He needed to find something, a cave, a ridge, anything that could block the wind and hold whatever heat his body could generate. He stepped into the snow and immediately sank to his knees. The surface crust, made brittle by the extreme cold, gave way to powder beneath that seemed to have no bottom. Walking would be nearly impossible. Surviving would be harder. Dominic pulled his legs free and began to move, choosing a direction arbitrarily because any direction was better than none. The wind returned, carrying with it ice crystals that stung his exposed face like needles. He pulled the thermal blanket tighter, creating a makeshift hood, and pressed forward. His thoughts drifted to Elena. She would be in Manhattan now, in the penthouse he had bought for them overlooking Central Park. She would be reading or perhaps working on the charity foundation she ran, the one that built schools in underserved neighborhoods, the one that nobody connected to his other business. She would be waiting for his call, the one he made every night no matter where in the world he was, the one where he told her about his day and she told him about hers, and they pretended, just for a few minutes, that they were an ordinary couple living an ordinary life. She wouldn't know yet. The flight plan had been filed under a shell company, and his absence at the meeting would be attributed to negotiation tactics before anyone thought to worry. By the time they realized something was wrong, he could already be dead. No, he rejected the thought as firmly as he had rejected every obstacle that had ever stood in his way. He would not die here. He would not let Elena become a widow, would not let his organization fall into the chaos that would follow his death, would not give his enemies the satisfaction of knowing that what bullets and betrayals couldn't accomplish, the cold had done. He kept walking. The terrain began to change, though it was difficult to tell through the whiteness. The ground rose slightly, and Dominic could feel rock beneath the snow, hard, unyielding, real. He followed the incline, his legs burning with effort, his lungs aching from the cold air that felt like breathing broken glass. And then he saw it, a darker patch against the white, partially obscured by a drift of snow, a shadow where there should be no shadows. Dominic moved toward it with renewed purpose, his heart pounding harder, hope mixing with desperation in equal measure. It was a cave, small, barely tall enough for him to enter without ducking, but deep enough that the wind couldn't reach its interior. The rock walls were cold, but not frozen, and the floor was dry, relatively speaking. It was shelter, real shelter. He collapsed inside, his body finally surrendering to the exhaustion it had been fighting. For a long moment, he simply lay there, breathing, existing, feeling the absence of wind like a gift. The temperature was still well below zero, but without the wind chill, it felt almost warm by comparison. Dominic forced himself to think systematically. He needed to assess his injuries, inventory his supplies, create a plan. He had not built an empire by panicking when circumstances turned against him. He had built it by adapting, by thinking 3 steps ahead, by treating every problem as a puzzle with a solution. This was just another puzzle. A frozen, deadly, seemingly impossible puzzle, but a puzzle nonetheless. He unwrapped himself from the thermal blankets and examined his left side, where the pain had been radiating since he regained consciousness. His ribs were bruised, possibly cracked, but not broken, at least not badly enough to puncture anything vital. He could breathe without tasting metal, which meant his lungs were intact. He could move all his limbs, could feel his fingers and toes, despite the numbness that was starting to set in. He was hurt, but he was functional. He laid out his supplies: thermal blankets, 3, flares, 4, first aid kit with bandages, antiseptic, pain relievers, emergency rations, sufficient for perhaps 3 days if he rationed carefully. The satellite, phone which he tried again and which still showed no signal, a multi-tool that had been in his pocket. The clothes he was wearing, expensive but not designed for Arctic survival, his watch, his wallet, useless here but containing a photograph of Elena that he would not abandon. Not enough, it wasn't nearly enough, but it was what he had, and he had worked with less before. He needed fire. Fire meant heat, meant being able to melt snow for water, meant being visible to any search parties that might eventually come looking. But he had no matches, no lighter, nothing that could produce flame in this frozen wasteland. The emergency kit had been missing its fire-starting materials, removed or never included. It didn't matter which. The result was the same. Dominic looked at the flares in his hand. They would burn hot and bright, but they were designed for signaling, not for sustained heat. Using one now would waste it, and he had only 4. He needed to save them for when they would matter most, when there was someone close enough to see them. Instead, he began to build. Using the multi-tool, he carved small notches in the cave walls and hung the thermal blankets to create a smaller interior space that his body heat could warm. He packed snow into the entrance, leaving only a small opening for air, creating insulation that would hold whatever warmth he could generate. He wrapped his feet in strips torn from the lining of his coat, adding layers between his skin and the cold. These were tricks he had learned decades ago from an old man named Victor, who had survived a winter in Siberia by refusing to die. Victor had worked for Dominic's father before the organization had been Dominic's, before Dominic had transformed it from a collection of street-level operations into the sophisticated empire it was today. Victor had told stories of the cold, of how it killed gently, how it made you sleepy and warm just before it took you forever. "The cold is a liar," Victor had said in his heavy accent. "It tells you to rest, to close your eyes, to let go. You must never believe it. You must fight every moment. The second you stop fighting, you belong to it." Dominic did not belong to the cold. He refused to. He curled into the smallest space he could, conserving heat, and began to eat the first of his emergency rations, a dense bar that tasted like cardboard but contained enough calories to keep his body generating warmth. He ate slowly, methodically, knowing that every bite mattered, that his body was burning fuel at an accelerated rate just to maintain temperature. Outside, the wind howled. It sounded almost alive, almost angry, as if it knew he had escaped its grip and was determined to find another way in. The cave walls seemed to vibrate with it, and Dominic could feel the cold pressing against his makeshift barriers, like a living thing testing for weakness. He thought about the men who were supposed to meet him in Fairbanks. They would wait at the appointed location, growing first impatient, then confused, then concerned. Someone would make calls. Someone would discover that his flight had never arrived. The search would begin, but it would begin in the wrong place. They would look along the filed flight path, not knowing that the storm had pushed them miles off course before the crash. It could be days before anyone thought to search this area, days that he did not have. Dominic closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to think. He needed to move, but he couldn't move in darkness and wind. He needed to be found, but he had no way to signal his location effectively. He needed to survive, but the cold was taking more from him with every passing hour. Heat, energy, hope. Hope. That was the most dangerous thing to lose. Victor had told him that too. "The body can endure more than you believe," the old man had said. "It is the mind that surrenders first. If you can keep your mind fighting, your body will follow." He thought of Elena again. He thought of the first time he had seen her, at a fundraiser he had attended for appearances, watching her speak passionately about children who needed better schools. He thought of how she had looked at him when she learned who he really was, not with fear or judgment, but with a quiet understanding that had disarmed him completely. He thought of their wedding, small and private, just the two of them and a priest on a beach in Sicily. He thought of the life they had built together, complicated and dangerous and beautiful. He would see her again. He would hold her again. He would not let this frozen wasteland take that from him. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel, because stories like this, stories of survival against impossible odds, deserve to be witnessed until the very end. The night lasted forever. Dominic drifted in and out of consciousness, never truly sleeping, but never fully awake. The cold crept through his barriers inch by inch, finding every gap, every weakness. His body shivered constantly. A good sign, he reminded himself. Shivering meant his body was still fighting, still generating heat. When the shivering stopped, that was when death began. He spoke to himself in the darkness, fragments of conversation and memory that kept his mind engaged when it wanted to retreat into the warm numbness that preceded hypothermia. He recited the names of everyone who worked for him, street by street, operation by operation. He calculated figures in his head, revenues, expenses, projections. He planned the conversation he would have with Kowalski when this was over, the terms he would demand, the concessions he would not make. He thought about his mother, dead 20 years now, but still vivid in his memory. She had been a small woman, fierce and loving in equal measure, who had worked 2 jobs to keep him fed when his father's drinking made money disappear. She had died before Dominic had truly become powerful, before he could give her the life she deserved. He had built his empire partly in her memory, a promise kept to a ghost that he would never be helpless again, that he would have the power to protect what mattered. She would have told him to fight. She would have told him that Varos did not surrender, not to poverty, not to enemies, not to cold that wanted to swallow them whole. He fought. When the grey light of Arctic dawn finally seeped through the gaps in his snow barrier, Dominic forced himself to move. His joints were stiff, his muscles reluctant, but he made them work through sheer force of will. He ate another portion of his rations, drank melted snow that he had warmed against his body through the night, and assessed his situation in the pale light. The wind had died. The sky was a flat grey that stretched from horizon to horizon without variation. The temperature, according to his watch, had dropped further during the night, -53 degrees now, cold enough that exposed skin would suffer. Damage within minutes. He needed to signal. He needed to be visible. Dominic crawled out of the cave and studied the landscape with new eyes. The terrain was more varied than it had appeared in the storm. There were ridges and depressions, areas where the snow had been sculpted by wind into shapes that almost looked intentional. About a half-mile distant, he could see a rise that stood above the surrounding landscape, a natural vantage point that would be visible from the air. That was where he needed to be. He gathered his supplies, wrapped himself as thoroughly as possible, and began the journey. Each step required conscious effort, lifting his foot, moving it forward, placing it down, checking that the snow would support his weight. The cold was a constant pressure, squeezing heat from his body, trying to convince his muscles to stop working. The half-mile felt like 10, but he made it. The rise was actually the exposed face of a rocky outcropping thrust up from the frozen earth by some ancient geological force. From its top, Dominic could see further than he had been able to see before, miles of white interrupted only by occasional shadows that might be other outcroppings, other potential shelters. More importantly, he could see the sky, and the sky could see him. He set to work. Using his multi-tool and rocks, he pried from the frozen ground. He began to create a signal. The dark rocks contrasted sharply against the white snow, and he arranged them in the largest pattern he could manage, an X, the universal symbol for a location marker. He trampled the snow around the rocks to create additional contrast, stamping out a rough circle that would be visible from above. It wasn't enough. He knew it wasn't enough. A single X on an infinite white canvas might be overlooked by even the most careful search. He needed more. He thought about the aircraft, about the debris that must be scattered around the crash site. Metal reflected light. Debris created patterns that didn't match the natural landscape. If he could mark a trail between the crash site and his location, any search party that found one might be able to find the other. But the crash site was far, too far to walk in these conditions, possibly too far to find again even if he tried. He had walked blindly in the storm, guided by nothing but desperation and luck. Retracing that path would be impossible. Instead, he focused on what he could control. He built up the rocks on the outcropping into a small cairn, adding height to his signal. He used one of the thermal blankets to create a makeshift flag that would flutter in any wind, its reflective surface catching whatever light existed. He did everything he could think of to make this spot visible, to make it different, to make it say someone is here, someone needs help. Then he returned to the cave to wait. Waiting was the hardest part. Dominic was not a patient man by nature. He had built his empire through action, through taking initiative, when others hesitated. But here action was limited by the cold and the terrain, and patience was the only weapon he had left. He passed the time by talking to Elena, not out loud. Speaking used energy, and his throat was already raw from the cold air, but in his mind carrying on a conversation that she would never hear. He told her about the crash, about the cold, about the ways he was fighting to survive. He told her things he had never said before, confessions that emerged only because he was alone with death at his shoulder. He told her about the first man he had ever seriously hurt, a rival who had threatened his mother when Dominic was barely 18. He had found the man and made clear that such threats would have consequences. It was the moment when Dominic had understood who he was, what he was capable of, what he would do to protect the people he loved. He told her about the guilt he carried, invisible and constant, for the things his business required. He had rules, lines he would not cross, people he would not harm. But even within those rules there was darkness. He had made peace with it long ago, had accepted it as the price of power, but sometimes, in quiet moments, he wondered if the price was too high. He told her about the fear, not the fear of dying. He had faced that possibility too many times for it to hold much terror, but the fear of leaving her alone. She was strong, stronger than anyone gave her credit for, but his world was dangerous, without him to protect her. Enemies might see opportunity. The thought of her in danger because of him, because of choices he had made decades before they met, was the only fear that could truly shake him. He told her he loved her. He said it over and over, a mantra against the cold, a promise that he would keep if the universe gave him any chance at all. The day passed. The temperature rose slightly as the weak Arctic sun reached its zenith, then began dropping again as it retreated toward the horizon. Dominic ate sparingly, drank melted snow, and kept himself awake through sheer determination. He watched the sky for aircraft, listened for engines, hoped with an intensity that surprised him. Nothing came. The second night was worse than the first. The cold seemed to have found new ways into his shelter, and his body's resources were running lower. He shivered less frequently now, which should have frightened him, but mostly just felt like relief from the exhausting motion. He caught himself, wanting to sleep, really sleep, not the half-conscious drifting of the night before, but true unconsciousness. Victor's voice echoed in his memory. "The cold is a liar." He forced himself to move, to shift position, to do anything that kept his body from settling into the stillness that would become permanent. He counted backward from 1,000 in Italian, then in English, then in the fragments of Russian he remembered from his childhood neighborhood. He recited the names of every book on the shelf in his home office, every painting on the walls of the penthouse, every piece of furniture in the bedroom he shared with Elena. He survived the night. Barely. Dawn brought clouds, thick, grey masses that rolled in from the north and obscured what little sunlight the Arctic day provided. The temperature dropped further, the clouds trapping cold air against the ground like a ceiling pressing down. Dominic checked his watch and saw a number that made his stomach clench. -61 degrees. He was running out of time. His food was nearly gone, one more day's worth at most, and that was stretching it. His water was whatever snow he could melt with his body heat, which wasn't nearly enough. His body was burning through its reserves at an alarming rate, consuming itself to generate heat that the cold absorbed instantly. He needed to do something. He couldn't just wait any longer. The decision came to him slowly, born of desperation and calculation. He would use one of the flares, not to signal a search party he couldn't see, but to start a fire. A real fire with fuel from the scrub brush he had seen growing in the crevices of the rocky outcropping. It would consume a quarter of his signaling capability, but it would give him heat, would let him melt water more efficiently, would keep him alive long enough for rescue to come. If rescue came. He crawled out of the cave and made his way to the outcropping, moving slower now than he had the day before. The scrub brush was frozen solid but dead, dry enough to burn if he could get it started. He gathered as much as he could carry, his fingers clumsy in their layers of improvised insulation, his body protesting every moment of exposure to the open air. Back in the cave, he arranged the brush in a careful pile. He held the flare ready, knowing that once he started this, he couldn't take it back. The flare would burn for about a minute, enough time to ignite the brush if he did it right, not enough time for a second attempt. He struck the flare. Light exploded in the darkness of the cave, red and brilliant, almost painful after so long in the grey-white world of the Arctic. Dominic thrust the flare into the pile of brush, holding it steady, willing the flames to catch. For a terrible moment, nothing happened. The brush was too frozen, too wet, too reluctant to burn. The flare's light began to dim, its fuel running low. Then, with a soft crackle that sounded like a promise, the brush ignited. The fire was small at first, barely more than a glow. Dominic fed it carefully, adding dried grass and smaller twigs, protecting the fragile flames from any draft. Slowly, incrementally, the fire grew, until it was producing real heat, heat that he could feel on his face, heat that drove back the cold even in this tiny space. He wept. He didn't mean to, didn't want to, but the relief was overwhelming. For the first time in 2 days, he was warm. Not comfortable, not safe, but warm. It was enough to make everything else seem possible. He melted snow and drank properly for the first time, the water feeling like medicine as it went down. He dried his innermost layers of clothing by the fire, then put them back on, marveling at how much difference warm fabric made. He let himself rest, truly rest, while the fire burned and the cold retreated. He thought about the path that had led him here, not the physical path from the crashed aircraft, but the path of his life, the choices he had made, the compromises he had accepted, the empire he had built. He had told himself for years that power was protection, that strength was safety, that controlling his world meant he could keep the people he loved from harm. But here, in this frozen wilderness, all his power meant nothing. The cold didn't care how many men answered to his call. The ice didn't respect his reputation. Nature was the great equalizer, stripping away everything that wasn't essential, leaving only the raw human animal fighting to survive. And that animal, Dominic realized, was stronger than he had known. Beneath the expensive suits and the calculated intimidation and the carefully maintained image was a boy from Brooklyn who had learned to fight because fighting was the only way to survive. That boy was still there, still alive, still refusing to surrender. The fire began to die as his fuel ran low, and Dominic knew he would need to gather more. He would need to venture out again into the cold, would need to find more. Brush, more anything that would burn. It would be harder now. The closest sources had already been harvested, and anything farther away would require more exposure, more risk. But he would do it, because the alternative was giving up, and Dominic Varro did not give up. He never had, and he wouldn't start now. Not when Eleanor was waiting for him, not when there was still a chance, however small, that he could make it home. He let the fire burn to embers, then carefully banked them, preserving the heat for when he returned. He wrapped himself in his layers and crawled out of the cave into the grey Arctic day, ready to fight for another few hours of warmth. The cold welcomed him back like an old enemy, patient and relentless. But Dominic was relentless too. It was the one advantage he had in this battle. The cold didn't care whether he lived or died, but he cared very much indeed. The clouds broke on the 3rd day. Dominic emerged from his cave to find the sky transformed, pale blue, stretching from horizon to horizon, the first color other than white and gray he had seen since the crash. The sun hung low, barely above the mountains in the distance, but it was there, casting long shadows across the snow and making the ice crystals sparkle like scattered diamonds. For a moment he just stood and looked. The beauty was overwhelming, almost obscene in its indifference to his suffering. The Arctic didn't know or care that he was dying. It simply existed, vast and ancient, and utterly unconcerned with the small human drama playing out on its surface. He checked his watch. -58 degrees. Warmer than yesterday, though the word warm felt like a cruel joke. His supplies were critically low. The last of the food had been eaten the night before, and his body was beginning to consume itself for fuel. He could feel it in the weakness of his limbs, the fog that kept creeping into his thoughts, the way his heart seemed to beat slower with each passing hour. Today would likely be his last chance. If rescue didn't come today, it probably wouldn't come at all, not in time anyway. He made his way to the outcropping where he had built his signal, checking that everything was still in place. The rock cairn had survived the night, and the thermal blanket flag still fluttered weakly in the slight breeze. The X he had created was visible against the snow, though smaller than it had seemed when he was building it. From the air, from a moving aircraft, would it be enough? Would anyone even be looking? He had 2 flares left. He would save them for the moment when they might matter, when he could hear an engine, see a search pattern, know that help was close enough to see his signal. The morning passed in a haze of cold and waiting. Dominic sat on the exposed rock of the outcropping, wrapped in his thermal blankets, watching the sky with eyes that burned from the brightness of the snow. He didn't have the energy to pace, didn't have the calories to spare for unnecessary movement. He simply sat and watched and waited, like a monk in meditation, like a condemned man awaiting verdict. He thought about the organization he had built, about what would happen if he didn't return. His second-in-command, Marco, was capable. He had been groomed for leadership for years, had proven himself in countless situations. The transition would be difficult but not impossible. The families would negotiate new arrangements. Territories would shift, alliances would realign, life would go on. But Elena would not simply move on. She would grieve deeply and genuinely because she loved him in a way he still sometimes couldn't believe. She would be supported by his organization. He had made sure of that, had left instructions and resources that would keep her safe and comfortable for the rest of her life. But money and protection were not the same as presence. They could not hold her at night, could not make her laugh, could not share the small moments that made a life worth living. He had to get home to her. He had to. The sound came so gradually that he almost didn't notice it. A low drone, barely distinguishable from the ringing in his ears that the cold had caused. He froze, listening, hardly daring to breathe. Was it real? Was he imagining it? His mind had been playing tricks on him for days now, showing him shapes in the snow that weren't there, sounds that existed only in his deteriorating neurons. But no, it was growing louder. An engine, an aircraft engine. Dominic lurched to his feet, searching the sky with desperate intensity. There, to the south, a dark speck against the pale blue, moving slowly, following a search pattern that any professional pilot would recognize. They were actually looking, and they were close enough that he could hear them. He grabbed his flares with hands that shook from more than just cold. One chance. He had one chance to make them see him. One moment when their course would bring them close enough that his signal might register against the endless white. He waited. It was the hardest thing he had ever done, standing there with salvation in sight, forcing himself not to waste his only opportunity by acting too soon. He watched the aircraft's path, calculated its trajectory, estimated the moment when it would be closest to his position. Now. He struck the first flare and held it high, waving it in wide arcs, the red smoke streaming behind like a banner of desperation. The brightness was almost blinding after so long in the white world, and he had to squint against it, even as he prayed it would be seen. The aircraft continued on its path. It didn't turn, didn't alter course, didn't give any sign that the pilot had noticed the tiny red spark against the infinite white. No. No. Dominic struck the second flare, his last flare, and waved it with everything he had left. He was shouting now, meaningless sounds that the wind carried away, his voice cracking from disuse and cold. He jumped up and down despite his weakness, creating motion, creating difference, creating anything that might catch a pilot's eye. The aircraft began to turn. For a moment, Dominic couldn't believe it. He stood frozen, the flare still burning in his hand, watching as the plane banked and came back around. It was heading toward him now, descending, following the line of red smoke to its source. They had seen him. They had actually seen him. The aircraft, a small bush plane designed for exactly these conditions, circled once over his position, then began looking for a place to land. The terrain was treacherous, all hidden rocks and uncertain snow depth, but the pilot was skilled. A quarter-mile away, the plane touched down in a spray of powder, the skis on its landing gear finding purchase on the frozen surface. Dominic tried to walk toward it, but found his legs wouldn't cooperate. The adrenaline that had kept him upright was fading, and with it went the last of his strength. He fell to his knees in the snow, then onto his side, watching through dimming vision as figures emerged from the aircraft and began running toward him. He heard voices, concerned, professional, speaking the calm language of rescue workers, who had done this many times before. Hands touched him, assessed him, wrapped him in new blankets that felt impossibly warm compared to his own. Someone was asking him questions, but the words seemed to come from very far away, through a fog that was growing thicker by the second. "Sir, can you hear me? What's your name?" He tried to answer, but his voice came out as barely a whisper. "Dominic. Varro." There was a pause, a murmur of recognition. His name meant something to these people, whether they were search and rescue or something else. They knew who he was, knew what finding him would mean. "You're going to be okay, Mr. Varro. We've got you. Just stay with us." He tried to nod, tried to show that he understood, but his body was done listening to commands. The cold had been holding him in a kind of suspended animation, keeping him functional through crisis, and now that safety had arrived, it was releasing its grip all at once. Darkness crept in from the edges of his vision, warm and welcoming, nothing like the cold darkness he had been fighting. The last thing he saw before consciousness left him was the sun, hanging low on the horizon, painting the snow in shades of gold and rose. It was beautiful. After 3 days of fighting to survive in this frozen hell, the last thing he saw was beauty. Then there was nothing. If this moment touched you, please leave a comment saying, "The cold may have tested him, but it could not break him." Your words become part of this story's living memory. The hospital in Fairbanks was warm. It seemed like such a simple observation, almost absurd in its obviousness, but Dominic couldn't stop noticing it. The warmth seeped into his bones, filled spaces that had been cold for so long he had forgotten they existed. He lay in the hospital bed, wrapped in heated blankets, IV fluids slowly rehydrating cells that had been running on nothing for days, and he marveled at the simple miracle of being warm. He had been unconscious for 16 hours after the rescue. Severe hypothermia, the doctors explained. His core temperature had dropped to levels that should have been fatal. The only reason he had survived was his body's own stubborn refusal to surrender, combined with the insulation he had improvised and the fire he had managed to start. Even so, he had come close. Closer than he wanted to think about. There was frostbite on his fingers and toes, but the doctors were optimistic. With proper treatment, he would keep all of them. Though there might be lasting sensitivity to cold. There was damage to his lungs from breathing frigid air for so long, but that too would heal with time. His ribs, as he had suspected, were cracked, but not broken. His body, against all odds, had survived. His mind was another matter. Something had changed in those 3 days on the ice. Dominic could feel it, a shift in his internal architecture that he couldn't quite name. He had faced death before, in business negotiations that went wrong, in conflicts with rival organizations, in the simple reality of living in a world where powerful men made enemies. But those had been human threats, comprehensible and defeatable. The cold had been different. The cold hadn't wanted anything from him, hadn't been trying to prove a point or send a message. It had simply been vast and indifferent, and he had survived not by defeating it, but by enduring it. The experience had stripped away something, layers of certainty perhaps, assumptions about his own strength and control. He had built his life on the premise that power could protect him, that enough money and influence and reputation could keep danger at bay. The Arctic had proven that premise false. In the end, the only thing that had kept him alive was his own will to survive, his own refusal to stop fighting. And Elena. The thought of her had been his anchor through the worst moments, the reason he kept moving when his body begged to stop. Love had kept him alive when power could not. She arrived on the second day. Dominic had been awake for a few hours, slowly regaining strength, when the door to his private room opened and she walked in. She looked tired, the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that came from days of worry and sleepless nights, but to him she had never been more beautiful. She crossed the room in 3 quick strides, and then she was in his arms, her face pressed against his chest, her body shaking with sobs she had clearly been holding back for days. "I thought I lost you," she whispered, the words muffled against him. "When they called, when they said the plane had gone down, I thought—" "I know." He held her as tightly as his weakened arms would allow, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling the reality of her presence drive away the last lingering shadows of those frozen days. "I know, but I'm here. I'm here. And I'm not going anywhere." She pulled back to look at his face, her eyes red from crying but fierce with an intensity he recognized. "What happened? They said you crashed, that you were alone for 3 days." He told her. Everything. The crash, the cold, the desperate shelter in the cave, the fire that had saved his life, the signal that had finally brought rescue. He told her about the conversations he had carried on with her in his head, the things he had confessed to the darkness when he thought he might never have another chance to confess them. He told her about the fear, not of dying, but of leaving her alone. She listened without interrupting, her hand tight in his, her eyes never leaving his face. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "You thought about me," she finally said. "When everything was falling apart, when you were fighting just to survive, you thought about me." "You were all I thought about," he admitted. "You were the reason I kept fighting, the reason I didn't give up when giving up would have been so much easier." She leaned forward and kissed him gently, mindful of his cracked ribs and the medical equipment attached to him. "I love you," she said against his lips. "I have always loved you, and I will always love you, and I am so incredibly grateful that you came back to me. I made you a promise," he said, "on our wedding day, that nothing would keep me from coming home to you. I intend to keep that promise for as long as I live." They stayed like that for a long time, holding each other in the warm hospital room while the Alaskan winter continued outside. The machines beeped their quiet rhythms, monitoring the slow recovery of a body that had come back from the edge of death. The world outside continued its business, unaware or unconcerned with the small miracle happening. In room 412. Later, when Elena had gone to find food and Dominic was alone again, Marco arrived. His second-in-command looked older than he had a week ago, as if the stress of the past few days had aged him years. He stood in the doorway of the room, uncertainty visible in his posture, an unusual expression for a man who dealt with dangerous situations as a matter of course. "Boss," he said, we weren't sure you would make it." "Neither was I," Dominic admitted. "Come in, close the door." Marco obeyed, pulling a chair to the bedside. For a moment neither man spoke. The silence filled with all the things that needed to be said, and neither knew how to begin. "The Kowalski meeting," Dominic finally said. "What happened?" "Rescheduled. They understood the circumstances. Everyone understood." Marco paused. The news spread fast. Within hours of the search starting, everyone knew. The Kowalskis, the Fernandez family, the operations in Chicago and Miami. Everyone. And they sent messages. All of them. Even the families we've had conflicts with. They wanted to express concern, respect. Marco shook his head, as if still processing it himself. "Your disappearance reminded everyone of something, I think. We fight over territory and money and influence, but in the end we're all just people, all vulnerable to things bigger than ourselves." Dominic considered this. In his world, displays of vulnerability were dangerous. They invited exploitation, tested loyalty, opened doors that were better kept closed. But something about what Marco was describing felt different. Not weakness exposed, but humanity revealed. "What about our own people?" he asked. "Scared, loyal, ready." Marco met his eyes. "When I told them you had been found, that you were going to survive, there were men who cried. Men I've never seen show any emotion at all. You inspire something in them, boss. Something more than fear or obligation. They believe in you." "Do they?" Dominic wasn't sure. What he felt about that. Being feared was simple. It was a transaction, power exchanged for compliance. Being believed in was more complicated. It carried responsibilities he wasn't sure he had fully understood before. "I need to tell you something," Marco continued, his voice dropping. "While you were missing, while we didn't know if you would be found, I did a lot of thinking about the organization, about what it means, about what it would become without you. And I realized I don't want it, the leadership, I mean. If something had happened to you, I would have stepped up because that's my job. But I don't want to be you. I don't want the weight you carry. He looked down at his hands. I don't know how you've carried it all these years. Dominic thought about the weight Marco was describing. The endless decisions, the constant calculations, the lives that hung on every choice he made. He had grown so accustomed to it that he had stopped noticing, like a person who has carried a stone for so long they've forgotten they're carrying anything at all. Sometimes I don't know either, he admitted. It was the most honest thing he had said to Marco in years. But I've learned something over the past few days. Something important. What's that? The weight isn't the point, the power isn't the point. I've spent years accumulating both, thinking they would protect me, protect the people I love. But out there on the ice, none of it mattered. The only thing that kept me alive was the same thing that would have kept anyone alive, the will to survive, the love I had to come home to. He paused, gathering thoughts that were still forming. I've been so focused on building walls against the world that I forgot the walls don't matter if there's nothing worth protecting inside them. Marco was quiet for a moment. What are you saying? I'm saying things need to change. I'm saying that when I get out of this hospital, I want to take a hard look at everything we do. Not to abandon it. The organization supports too many people, provides too much stability, but to reshape it, to find ways to do what we do that don't require us to become monsters. Is that even possible? I don't know, Dominic admitted, but I spent 3 days in conditions that should have killed me and I came out alive. If that's possible, maybe other impossible things are possible too. Marco nodded slowly, processing. Then, unexpectedly, he smiled. You know, boss, I think the cold might have been good for you. The cold was the worst experience of my life, and yes, I think you might be right. They talked for another hour, practical matters, the state of various operations, issues that needed attention when Dominic returned. But underneath the business conversation was something new, something that hadn't existed before. An understanding that the men who ran this organization were more than their roles, more than the functions they served. They were people, with fears and hopes and the capacity for change. After Marco left, Dominic lay in the warm bed and stared at the ceiling. His body was healing. His mind was something. Not healed exactly, but transformed. The near-death experience had cracked something open inside him, let light into places that had been dark for a very long time. He didn't know what the future would hold. He didn't know if he could actually reshape an empire built on foundations he was only now beginning to question. He didn't know if the other families would accept whatever changes he tried to make, or if they would see it as weakness to be exploited. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He was alive. Against all odds, against the cold that should have claimed him, against the vast indifference of the Arctic that had tried to swallow him whole, he was alive. And that meant he had a chance to become something more than he had been. Not everyone got that chance. He would not waste it. Recovery was slow. The doctors had warned him that healing from severe hypothermia was a marathon, not a sprint. His body had been pushed to its absolute limits, had operated for days on emergency reserves, and now it needed time to rebuild what the cold had consumed. Patience, they said. Rest. Time. Dominic had never been good at patience. After a week in the Fairbanks Hospital, he was transferred to a private medical facility in New York. Elena traveled with him, refusing to leave his side despite his insistence that she had her own life to manage. "My life is you," she said simply, and he didn't argue further. The facility was quiet and secure, the kind of place where powerful men came to recover from the various emergencies their lives produced. Dominic's suite had windows overlooking a garden that was currently buried under January snow, and he spent hours watching the patterns the winter wind created, no longer seeing cold as an enemy, but as a force he had survived, had almost come to understand. Elena brought him books, and he read more in those weeks of recovery than he had in years. Philosophy, history, biographies of men who had transformed themselves and their circumstances. He was searching for something, though he wasn't sure what, a framework perhaps for the changes he wanted to make, a roadmap for becoming someone new while still honoring who he had been. He also talked, long conversations with Elena about their future, about the life they wanted to build, long conversations with Marco about the organization, about what was essential and what could be changed, long conversations with himself in the quiet hours of the night when sleep wouldn't come, about the man he had been and the man he wanted to become. The cold had not broken him, but it had cracked him open and light was streaming through the cracks. After 3 weeks, he was well enough to leave the facility, though the doctors cautioned that full recovery would take months. Eleanor took him home, to the penthouse, overlooking Central Park, to the bedroom they shared, to the life they had built together. He stood at the window and looked out at the city, the millions of lives being lived in the maze of streets and buildings below, and felt something he hadn't felt in years: humility. All of those people were fighting their own battles, facing their own frozen wastelands, struggling to survive circumstances that would kill a lesser soul. He was not special. He was just a man who had been given more resources than most, who had built power out of determination and ruthlessness, who had now been reminded that none of it could protect him from the universe's indifference. But that was okay. That was, he was beginning to understand, exactly as it should be. The meeting with Kowalski finally happened a month after his rescue, not in Fairbanks, as originally planned, but in a neutral location, a restaurant in Chicago known for hosting negotiations between families who needed to resolve differences without violence. Dominic arrived with Marco and 2 other men, all of them armed, none of them expecting trouble, but all of them prepared for it. The Kowalski delegation was already there, 3 men at a table in the private room, their faces showing the kind of guarded neutrality that masked whatever they were actually thinking. The meeting began with formalities, the rituals of respect that governed interactions between organizations. Then Kowalski himself, a heavy-set man with eyes that missed nothing, leaned forward and spoke. "Before we discuss business, I want to say something." His voice was rough, accented with Eastern European origins. "What happened to you? The crash, the survival. It reminded me of something my father used to say. He survived the labor camps, came to this country with nothing, built everything from scratch. He used to tell me that a man's character is not revealed in prosperity. It is revealed in adversity." Dominic nodded, waiting. 3 days. In temperatures that would kill most men in hours. No supplies, no shelter, no way to call for help. And you survived. You found a way. Kowalski shook his head. "I came here ready to negotiate hard, to push for everything I could get, but I find I cannot do that. Not to a man who has proven what you have proven." This was unexpected. Dominic kept his face neutral, but his mind was racing. "What are you proposing?" "The territories in dispute. Take them, all of them. I will not contest your claim." Marco shifted beside him, surprise visible in his posture. Dominic raised a hand slightly, keeping him silent. "Why?" he asked Kowalski directly. "Because my father also used to say that you should never make an enemy of a man who refuses to die. Such a man will haunt you forever." Kowalski smiled, a thin expression that didn't reach his eyes. "And because I have daughters. 3 daughters, who I hope will never have to survive what you survived. If making peace with you means they inherit a more stable world, then that is the price I am happy to pay." The negotiation that Dominic had spent weeks preparing for, that had been important enough to risk the flight that had nearly killed him, was over before it really began. Not because he had intimidated or outmaneuvered his rival, but because his survival had spoken louder than any threat could have. He accepted the terms. He offered, in return, certain considerations that would benefit Kowalski's operations without threatening his own. They shook hands, and an alliance was born where a conflict had been brewing. On the drive back to New York, Marco couldn't contain himself any longer. "What just happened? I've never seen Kowalski back down from anything. Never." "He didn't back down," Dominic said slowly, still processing the encounter himself. He recognized something. something I'm still learning to understand myself. What? That power isn't always about who can destroy whom. Sometimes it's about who can endure, who can survive. He looked out the window at the passing landscape, thinking about the frozen wasteland he had escaped, about the warmth of his wife's arms, about the empire he had built, and the chance he now had to rebuild it. I survived the impossible. That changes how people see me. It changes how I see myself. So what now? Now we go home. We take care of our people. We build something that will last, something that isn't just based on fear. He turned to look at Marco. Directly. The cold taught me something, Marco. It taught me that in the end we're all fragile, all temporary. The only thing that survives us is what we build that serves others. I want to build something worth surviving for. Marco was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded. I think I understand, boss. I think I'm starting to understand. The rest of the drive passed in comfortable silence. Outside, the American landscape rolled by, cities and farms and forests, all of it going about its business regardless of what happened in the high-level negotiations of men like Dominic Varro. He watched it all pass, feeling a connection to it that he hadn't felt in years. He was part of this world, not above it, not separate from it, not protected from it by walls of money and power. Just part of it like everyone else, doing his best to survive and maybe leave something behind that mattered. The penthouse was warm when he returned. Eleanor was waiting, the dinner she had prepared filling the apartment with smells that made his mouth water and his heart ache with gratitude. She looked up when he walked in, her face lighting with the smile she reserved only for him. How did it go? Better than expected, he said, crossing to her, pulling her into his arms. Much better than expected. Good. She rested her head against his chest, listening to his heartbeat. I'm glad you're home. Me too, he said. More than you know. They stood like that for a while, holding each other in the warm apartment while the city sparkled outside the windows. The cold was far away now, nothing but a memory and a scar on his soul that would never fully heal. But scars were okay. Scars meant you had survived something, had faced something terrible, and come out the other side. Dominic Varro had faced the deadliest cold on earth, and he had survived. Now it was time to figure out what to do with the life he had fought so hard to keep. 5 years later, the garden was in full bloom. Dominic stood at the edge of the stone patio, watching the roses climb the trellis he had built with his own hands. The scent was intoxicating, rich and sweet, carrying on the warm summer breeze that rustled through the trees surrounding the estate. Behind him, he could hear the sounds of a party in full swing. Laughter, conversation, the clinking of glasses, the live music drifting from the terrace. The estate was different from the penthouse in Manhattan. Larger, yes, but that wasn't what mattered. What mattered was that it was alive, filled with people he cared about, surrounded by gardens and forests and space to breathe. He had bought it 2 years after his return from Alaska, part of a deliberate effort to change how he lived, how he worked, how he related to the world around him. The organization had changed too, not abandoned. The people who depended on it, the legitimate businesses that had grown from its roots, the stability it provided to communities that would otherwise be vulnerable, all of that remained. But the darker aspects had been carefully, systematically transformed. Operations that had once operated in shadows now functioned in daylight. Partnerships with law enforcement had replaced the adversarial relationships of the past. Young men who might once have been recruited into dangerous work were instead channeled into education, into legitimate careers, into lives that didn't require them to carry weapons or live in fear. It had not been easy. There had been resistance from within and without. Some of the old guard had left, unable or unwilling to adapt to the new direction. Some rivals had seen the changes as weakness, had tried to exploit them. But Dominic had been firm, and Marco, who had grown into the role of his true partner, not just his subordinate, had been firmer still. Together they had navigated the transition, and now, 5 years later, the organization was stronger than it had ever been. Not because it was more feared, but because It was more respected. And through it all, Eleanor had been beside him. She walked across the patio now, carrying 2 glasses of champagne, her dress catching the late afternoon light. She was more beautiful than she had been on the day they met, not despite the years that had passed, but because of them. Every laugh line, every grey hair, every mark that time had left on her face was evidence of a life lived fully, of joy and sorrow, and everything in between. "You're brooding again," she said, handing him a glass. "I'm not brooding, I'm reflecting." "You say potato, I say brooding." She smiled, taking his arm. "Come back to the party. Your daughter is asking for you." His daughter, Lucia. 3 years old, named for his mother, the center of his universe in a way he had never imagined another human being could be. She had been born 18 months after his return from Alaska, and from the moment he had first held her, Dominic had understood that everything had changed. This tiny person, with her mother's eyes and her grandmother's fierce spirit, depended on him completely. Not on his power or his reputation or his empire, on him. On his presence, his love, his commitment to being there for her every single day. He could not be the man he had once been and also be the father she deserved. The cold had begun his transformation. Lucia had completed it. He let Elena lead him back to the party, where Lucia was indeed waiting, her face smeared with chocolate cake, her arms reaching for him the moment she saw him approaching. He swept her up, ignoring the chocolate that immediately transferred to his white shirt, listening to her babble about the party and the cake and the dog she had played with and everything else that filled her small, wonderful world. "Daddy," she said, suddenly serious in the way only a 3-year-old could be, "why is everybody here?" "Because it's a special day, little flower. Do you know what day it is?" She scrunched her face in concentration. "Saturday." He laughed. A real laugh, deep and full, the kind of laugh that had once been rare for him and was now frequent. "Yes, it's Saturday, but it's also the anniversary of when Daddy came home, when Daddy decided to stay home forever." "You went away?" She looked concerned, as if the idea of him being anywhere but here was deeply troubling. "Once, a long time ago. But I came back. I will always come back to you." She accepted this with the trust that only young children possess, the absolute faith that the people who loved her would always be there. It was a faith he had vowed to himself he would never betray. Elena was watching them, her expression soft. He caught her eye and saw everything there, the love, the pride, the memory of those terrible days when she had thought she might never see him again. They didn't talk about Alaska often. They didn't need to. It lived between them, a shared understanding that every day since had been a gift. Marco approached, Kowalski's daughter on his arm. That was another thing that had changed. The alliance born in that Chicago restaurant had deepened over the years, had become genuine friendship as the two organizations found ways to work together rather than against each other. Marco and Kowalski's daughter had met at a joint charity event, and now they were engaged, their union symbolizing a new era of cooperation. "Boss," Marco said, though the word was more habit than hierarchy at this point, "Kowalski wants to make a toast, something about old enemies and new friends." Dominic nodded past Lucia to Elena and followed Marco to the terrace where the old man was waiting. Kowalski looked older now, they all did, but there was a peace in his eyes that hadn't been there 5 years ago. The wars were over, at least for their generation. What came next would be up to their children, but the foundation they were building was strong. The toast was simple but sincere. To survival, to change, to the families they had built and the future they were creating together. Glasses were raised, champagne was drunk, and the party continued as the sun began to set over the garden. Later, after the guests had gone and Lucia was asleep in her bed, Dominic sat with Elena on the balcony of their bedroom, watching the stars emerge from the darkening sky. The night was warm, nothing like those frozen nights in Alaska, but he still felt the occasional shiver of memory. "I've been thinking," he said, "about going back." Elena didn't answer immediately. She knew what he meant. He had mentioned it before, the desire to return to the place where he had nearly died, to face it again on his own terms. "Why?" she finally asked. "I don't know exactly. Closure, maybe. Or gratitude. That place, it tried to kill me, but it also saved me. It made me who I am now." He paused, searching for words. "I want to see it again. I want to stand there and know that I survived, that I came out of that frozen hell and built something beautiful from the ashes of who I used to be. Would you want me to come with you?" He considered it. Part of him wanted to face it alone, to prove something to himself that he wasn't sure needed proving anymore. But another part, the part that had grown stronger every year since his return, knew that he didn't need to prove anything. What he needed was to share. "Yes," he said, "I would want you with me. I would want to show you where I fought to survive, where I thought about you, every moment, where you were the reason I kept fighting." He took her hand. "It's part of our story now. It should be something we face together." She squeezed his hand. "Then we'll go. When the time is right, we'll go together." They sat in comfortable silence after that, watching the stars and feeling the warmth of the night and the warmth of each other. The cold was far away, but it would always be part of them, a reminder that survival was not guaranteed, that every day was a gift, that the life they had built was precious because it had so nearly been lost. Dominic thought about the man he had been before the crash, the hard, controlled, fearful man who had built walls against the world and called it strength. That man had thought he knew what power was, what success looked like, what mattered and what didn't. That man had been wrong about almost everything. The cold had burned away his illusions, had stripped him down to the essential core of who he was, and what remained had surprised him. Beneath all the armor, beneath all the power and reputation and fear, there had been a man who just wanted to love and be loved, a man who wanted to protect his family, to build something that would last, to leave the world better than he had found it. The Arctic had taken almost everything from him, but it had given him back himself. He looked at Elena, his wife, his partner, his reason for surviving, and felt a gratitude so profound it threatened to overwhelm him. She was watching, him, as if she could read his thoughts, as if she knew exactly what was passing through his mind. "I love you," he said. "Have I told you that today?" "Only about a dozen times, but I never get tired of hearing it." "Good, because I plan to keep saying it for the rest of our lives." She leaned against him, her head on his shoulder, and they watched the stars together. Somewhere out there, the Arctic still waited, frozen and ancient and utterly indifferent to the affairs of men. But it no longer held any power over Dominic Varro. He had faced the deadliest cold on Earth, and he had won, not by conquering it, but by enduring it, by refusing to give up, by finding, in the darkest moments, a love worth surviving for. That was the lesson the ice had taught him. That was the gift buried in the suffering. Life was not about avoiding pain or death. Those were inevitable, part of the price of existence. Life was about what you did with the time you had. It was about the people you loved, the legacy you built, the moments of beauty and connection that made the struggle worthwhile. Dominic Varro had survived at -81 degrees. He had been isolated in the ice, facing the deadliest cold on Earth, and he had emerged not as the man he had been, but as the man he was always meant to become. If you've watched this far, it's because you liked this story. Leave a comment saying, "I've watched this far," so I can get to know you and see who really enjoys the stories here on the channel. And if this story touched your heart, if you felt the cold, the fear, the hope, the love, please hit that like button and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Stories like this remind us that no matter how dark and frozen our circumstances become, there is always a way through. There is always a reason to keep fighting. There is always warmth waiting on the other side. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. More stories of survival, love, and transformation are coming. Stories that will grip your heart and remind you what it means to be alive. This was Mafia Boss Survives at -81 degrees Celsius. Isolated in the ice, he faced the deadliest cold on Earth. And he won. Not because he was stronger than the cold, but because love is always stronger than death.